Hey everybody, Justin Colburn here for video number 3, illustrating the creation story of Genesis alongside the atomic science and elements. Today I will be talking about the periodic table, what it is, how it gets its shape, and how its true nature has been hidden in the small print of our science books. I am trying to keep my videos short because I know people are very busy and have a hard time seeing right now how all this fits into their everyday lives. There's a lot of information, but once we get past some basics to build a foundation of knowledge in atomic science, things will really start getting much easier and begin to fall into place. This video will be a little bit longer than the first two because I really want people to understand exactly what the periodic table represents and explain why I believe all this to be important. So the periodic table is a visual representation of all the building blocks of our universe called the elements. Everything you can see in your everyday life is represented here in logical order from A to Z. As scientists will admit, the periodic table does not get its shape by man. It gets its shape by the fundamental laws of quantum mechanics, the laws of nature, if you will. The shape of the periodic table is a discovery based on the observations of the quantities of particles within the individual atoms. You can think of the periodic table as a logical representation of the Legos of our universe from smallest to largest. It also turns out that the most logical structure also reveals the secrets of the individual elements as well. By looking at where the individual elements land in this structure, you can typically predict their behavior and find where they are located in our universe. There are a few exceptions, and those exceptions really stick out like sore thumbs and are used in my work to really put the pieces together with Genesis and the creation story. Now, I can't stress this enough, that even though the periodic table was just only recently discovered over the last 100 years or so, it has been here the whole time in the laws of the elements of matter. They are represented in this way based on the structures of the individual elements, the laws of quantum physics, and where they can be found in our universe. So here we see the smallest, lightest, and most abundant elements, hydrogen and helium, on top on energy level 1. Over 90% of our universe is hydrogen and helium, and 99% of these elements are in outer space and in our stars. You can initially think of elements getting their placement in this structure and in our universe by weight, although that is obviously not the only logic, or you would just see a vertical straight line of elements listing lightest to heaviest. So there are actually a few methods of logic which build this table, which are all built into the unchanging structures of the individual elements and the laws which govern the universe. Elements get their placement here first by atomic weight, then by electron energy level, and then by valence electrons, which just means the number of electrons occupying the outermost energy shell. This structure is widely accepted by the scientific community, and a great teaching tool for learning about the elements is actually built into the laws of the elements themselves. So this logical representation of the elements will really help you learn about and understand them. And now that I've explained this structure a little bit, I'm going to explain why we won't be using it. If you read the small print in your science books, you will actually see that this is not an entirely accurate illustration of the elements. So we have discovered that there is a teaching tool in the laws, and you are still able to predict how elements behave in this standard form, but right off the bat, by using this shortened structure, we are sacrificing logic for convenience. Using the shorter standard periodic table also makes things more confusing and harder to learn. In the beginning of my research, I thought that there was an actual reason why the rare earth elements were placed below the main structure in the periodic table. But after further research, I found out that the only reason given as to why they use the shortened version is because the wide version doesn't fit well on a standard sized piece of paper. Element expert and renowned chemist Theodore Gray states in his book, The Elements, "This is done for no other reason than to make the overall shape of the table more practical to print on posters and in books. But this is science, and isn't it unwise to make assumptions in science? Unless, of course, those assumptions are identified and work is being done to prove them as either true or false? Well, this is making the assumption that the bigger structure has no purpose or function. Since science is about discovery and truth, the logic of the elements of the periodic structure is not something that should be arbitrarily changed simply for convenience. So if you read the small print, the rare earth elements are shown below the main structure, but actually belong in the middle of this structure. Again, they shorten it down and say the true version is too wide to easily fit in textbooks, but we will be using the true periodic structure for my work. This 7x32 structure is actually the true representation of elements in perfect logical order. All your science books will tell you this in the small print, but only a few actually put the elements where they belong. A good one I found is called The Elements by Jack Challoner. Wikipedia actually uses the true periodic structure as well. You can type in any element on Google, select the Wikipedia link, scroll down, and you will find the true structure with whatever element you selected being highlighted in the structure. So we know that the true periodic structure is 32 elements wide because 32 is the maximum number of electrons that can occupy a single one of those 7 energy levels. The elements get their placement horizontally by atomic weight and electron energy level. They get their placement vertically by the outer electrons, which typically determines the behavior of any given element. Hydrogen and helium are found on top as the lightest and most abundant elements, then moving our way down through common elements like carbon and lead, and all the way down to unstable heavy radioactive elements which aren't found in nature. 118 discovered so far, and by my predictions there will be 2 more found, but we will save that for another video. So here it is, the holy grail of science in all its glory. The understanding of these elements is directly responsible for every single technology that has ever been created or ever will be created. And the great part is, the elements are everywhere. Since these elements are what everything is made of, we can find them in literally everything. The trick is knowing where to look for which ones and how to get them so they are not all mixed up. Pure elements is where the real power lies. Just think about the sun and how it is just a gigantic ball of hydrogen fusing and then splitting into more hydrogen, pumping out helium, light, and energy in the process. Now that you understand the periodic table a little bit better and you see it in its true form, let's talk about Genesis. Let's talk about how this book was written thousands of years ago. Think about how people didn't understand how everything was made up of tiny atoms that we couldn't see with our naked eyes. How in the world could a story of creation that was true survive thousands of years through all language translations? How could a story of creation be told simply, accurately, and fully without going into so much technical detail and mathematics that you quickly lose the reader? I do not think that it can be done better than the first 2 chapters of Genesis does it. When put in the proper context of the atomic science and the true periodic structure, it is the greatest story of creation ever told in the history of planet Earth. So in my first 2 videos I showed the parallels of the first 8 verses of Genesis chapter 1 compared to the first atom, hydrogen. If you haven't watched those videos yet, please do so before continuing. Before I continue on to day 2 and element 2, which I will do in a later video, I want to point out how Genesis is also describing not only the individual elements, but also the periodic structure as a whole. So one coincidence is something that can be ignored. Even 2 or 3 coincidences can be disregarded. But there comes a time when coincidences become so commonplace that they can no longer be considered coincidence. So let's really dissect the first couple chapters of Genesis. After all, if this is a book that is supposed to be the Word of God, the first couple chapters must be entirely true, or why should we believe the rest of it? I would never ask someone to believe blindly in something when I myself cannot do the same. Personally, I need tangible evidence, and scientific evidence is the best kind. If the creation story in Genesis does not match up with what we can observe in science, I will be the first to throw the book in the trash. But before we do that, let's really break down the creation story in Genesis, thoroughly picking it apart and find out what it says. At first, we are just going to be making a basic outline of Genesis before we dive into picking apart every single verse. So in quick summary, what does Genesis say? Well, first it says there were 7 days of creation and God rested on the 7th day. If we look a little closer, we will see that the creation is actually finished in the first verse of chapter 2, or the 32nd verse overall. Now, I already hear the critics saying, well, the verse numbers were not added until the 1600s. But let me point out that there was always clear spacing which separated the scriptures, and those verse numbers were correlated to that spacing. So really we are just dealing with the quantities of space within the text. So again, we see that in Genesis the creation is first finished on the first verse of chapter 2, or the 32nd verse starting from chapter 1. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them." It continues, "And on the 7th day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day and declared it holy, because on that day he rested from all the work which God created and made." So again, we see the creation being finished on the 7th day, with God resting on that 7th day. And we also see creation first being finished in the 32nd verse, or the first verse of chapter 2. Looking a little closer, notice how it states the seventh day 3 times. And everything I will be dealing with are things that you can find in any Bible, regardless of what version you are reading. So now, let's look again at the periodic structure, which is the scientific representation of all creation. Can anyone see any similarities? First, let's note how the true version of the periodic structure is 32 elements wide. Let's also note that there are 7 possible levels of energy which represent electron orbitals called periods. Let's also note some other 7s in this structure, since in Genesis it makes a point to identify the 7th day 3 separate times. So the first 7, we will look at the 7th period, where you will find the heavy, unstable, radioactive elements, most of which are not found anywhere in nature. Let's look at the second 7, being the 7th column. In this column we find only 2 elements. I think it's important to note that this is the only column in the entire periodic table where none of its elements can be found in nature. Promethium is an anomaly of science that we will talk about in great detail later. I think it's also important to note that no significant amount of any elements after uranium are found in nature and are all considered man-made elements. So in essence, nature stops at 7-7, and this is the point where the unstable, radioactive, man-made elements begin. Now let's take a look at the third 7 in this structure, the 7th element, nitrogen, which can be represented numerically by 777 because it consists of 7 protons, 7 neutrons, and 7 electrons. If anyone has taken a basic chemistry class, the first experiment you are likely to see with nitrogen is how it can freeze just about anything instantly. Nitrogen is also what is called an inert or inactive element. It is the most abundant pure element on our planet. So in comparison to Genesis, we have the creation being first finished in the 32nd verse. We also see creation being finished on the 7th day. Furthermore, we see in Genesis God resting on that 7th day and declaring it holy. Now, running back through the scientific representation of all creation in the true periodic structure, 7 periods with 32 groups of elements. When we look at the individual 7s contained within this structure, we see no elements with more than 7 energy levels past the 7th period. In the 7th group, we see the last of the elements found in nature. And in the 7th element, being nitrogen, which is inactive or inert, is widely used as a cryogenic freezing agent and is the most abundant pure element on the planet. On the 7th day in Genesis, remember it says, God rested and declared the day holy, which is another word for pure, right? Rest, inactive, freeze, pure, holy. 7 days, which are orbits of the Earth's crust. 7 periods, which are electron orbital energy levels, both representing that same orbital movement. So again, more coincidences between Genesis and the atomic science, and this is just the beginning, just a basic outline. As I will illustrate, Genesis continues describing this structure in chapter 2 and also describes individual elements in detail in chapter 1. Now, I understand that this is not a commonly held belief, nor are you likely to hear this translation at your church. You are more likely to hear a story about a literal talking snake and the fall of mankind coming from eating an apple. But I challenge you to open your mind and put the creation story of Genesis with where science says creation begins. Put the creation story with the periodic structure of elements and you will see how it is impossibly accurate. When you realize that Genesis is not just some fairy tale, you will begin to see how it can be applied to the things we actually observe in our world today, with the creation of nuclear weapons and their potential to kill billions of people and destroy our planet. You will not only learn about the elements of creation, but you will also find that Genesis is telling the greatest story of creation ever told. Thank you all for watching. More videos to come soon. God bless.